Functionalists often make the argument that our modern education system is necessary because our economy is rapidly changing and our schools help prepare our children for that type of economy. What Collins shows us is that the emergence of our education system is a function of people with power and privilege seeing threats to their privileged way of life and leveraging their power and privilege and making and promoting decisions that secured their own advantages. According to Collins, there are two types of education systems, a sponsored mobility system and a contested mobility system. In most societies, university is reserved for the elite. The rest of society gets access to major types of schooling experiences like commercial, technical, and lower level. You can consider the lower level education that provides students with shared commitments and capacities. People receiving this education may also make their way into short-term on-the-job training occupations. Technical skills education are related to education that provides training for specific occupations. Commercial can be linked to overseeing organizations where elite training may have people assuming leadership positions in major public, private, and governmental organizations and industries. These types of schooling have sponsored mobility, which basically means there's a clear connection between one's education and one's occupation. I had a friend, for example, who is Japanese. When she was in school, if you wanted to work for the government, you had to take an exam and test to get into the school that would train you for such work. She had a sister who wanted to go to medical school to become a researcher. And in order to do that, she had to take a test to get into that program. And she had to score high enough to be able to train for that specialization. While the education at those institutions may be challenging, according to my friend, the real pressure was getting into those schools. The whole process was highly centralized. If you wanted a specific profession, you had to take a specific test to go to a specific school. The scores and the admissions were published. Stakes were really high before you went into the program. And you could expect to get a job when you got out of the program. This is an example of a sponsored mobility education system. The US, on the other hand, is a contested mobility education system. Scholars and educators refer to our education system as a pipeline. That pipeline used to refer to just grades K through 12, and now it's often characterizing grades K through 16. I hate that, by the way. But anyway, everyone has access to schooling through grade 12, though people can drop out. But if you quit, you can still get a GED and enroll in higher ed. There are no sharp divisions between schools in terms of content or degrees. Moreover, you can drop out or flunk out and come back later, starting over or picking up where you left off. If you look at four-year universities, they are comprehensive in that schools tend to offer very similar programs and degree types, and you can switch majors and switch back. This is what I mean by no critical branching point and no sharp divisions. Schools across the country and across systems like A&M or UT or the California system all have high degrees of overlap in the types of degrees that they offer. For example, most schools offer a major in English, history, or political science, biology, chemistry, etc. But just because you get a degree with a particular major doesn't mean you will get a specific job or you will work in those industries or in those areas. In fact, even with a degree, you may not be able to find a job, a specific job, until you get past a licensure test. And that's because the organizational structure of education in the United States is very decentralized. Each state has its own higher education coordinating board, and each state's rules are different. Institutions within and across state lines compete with each other for students. And at the end of their degree plans or right after their degree completion, students start looking for jobs. And while faculty may write letters of recommendation or schools may host career fairs, at best the connection between institutions and job placements is a weak one. According to Collins, these three factors, immigration, growth of educational organizations, and development of colleges and universities, played a role in shaping our modern education system. And it was elites' concerns about these factors that served as catalysts for major shifts in the structure of our schooling. We had four major waves of immigration in our phases of immigration in our country's history. Collins writes about the first three. And in 1790, there were approximately 4 million people in the United States. And from that period onward, during the first immigration phase, immigrants were mostly coming from Northern and Western Europe. Most of those people were mostly Protestant and from one of three countries, the UK, Ireland, and the Netherlands. The UK and Ireland share a border on one side, and on another are only separated by about 75 miles of water. And the UK and the Netherlands are separated on the other side by a strait that's about 130 miles wide. And just for a point of reference, that's about the same distance between Corpus and San Antonio. Thus, when you look at the first wave of people coming to the United States, they were coming from lands and territories that were familiar. By 1850, though, 60 years later, the nation's population had increased by more than 500%. And again, during up until that period of time, we were seeing people mostly from Northern and Western Europe. But by the 1890s, 40% of the foreign-born population was Catholic, 5% was Jewish, and increasingly the immigrants were coming from Southern and Eastern European countries. The more distinct the immigrants were, the greater the problem Americans had with these immigrants. They were seen as other, darker, from more agricultural, less industrialized societies, and not Protestant. This continued through the 1920s when immigration policy changed again to privilege Northern and Western European immigrants, and for the first time impose a numerical cap upon the number of people who would be allowed to legally enter into the country. By the 1900s, a decade later, the US population was still exploding, and much of the growth was from immigrants, either as newcomers or newcomers having children. Over a third were foreigners or children of foreigners, and another 11% of people were African American. So again, nearly half of the population did not have their origins in those countries of the first wave of immigrants, which tended to be Northern and Western Europeans. This sparked a major reaction against the immigrant population for several reasons. It was the combination of the huge immigration influx and the transformations that were happening in the economy that made people feel unstable, insecure, and reactionary toward these immigrant populations. Now, immigrants tended to concentrate in port cities. These urban centers got bigger and bigger, and the cities weren't really planned. Like, the infrastructure was laid out in reaction to this massive rapid growth. We saw factories emerging in those urban centers, drawing in foreigners and workers from agricultural communities. New industries were emerging and or growing in size and scale. You had petroleum refining, steel manufacturing, electricity grids, railroads, the birth of the automobile industry, meat packing. We shifted away from small mom and pop local or regional businesses to major producers providing goods and services for the nation and in some cases globally, creating huge disparities in wealth and power. The technological changes like the railroad industry and electricity transformed the economy and connected states and municipalities, pulling more and more people into the urban centers. When you combine that with the influx of immigrants and the births of their children, the economic transformations also ushered in this sort of bureaucratization of work and workspaces where production and organization became more formal and mechanical. On top of that, you had the emergence of mass media, which tended to emphasize sensational news and also had an orientation of muckraking, fomenting concerns about chaos, the lack of control, and demographic shifts that would undermine the order and power of the Protestant establishment. Leaders in the communities, those whose families who had been around and were established, were concerned that people of their social position were not procreating fast enough, especially compared to the immigrants who were populating these urban centers. What's more, the immigrants were often linguistically, culturally, religiously different, and they were coming in such large numbers while being ethnically distinct that the establishment was concerned that they would begin voting as a bloc, engaging in commerce as a bloc, and disrupt the status quo. So the Protestant establishment really approached this kind of in two ways. First, you saw the KKK reemerge and target uh, local white ethnic minorities, especially Catholics and Jews, both of which were considered a separate race at that time. That's another conversation for another sociology class. But nonetheless, they were treated as these racially inferior groups, um, and groups like the KKK very much targeted them and were very nativist. Now, while politically groups were progressive toward regulations of business and toward, even in some instances, women's suffrage, these groups supported policies designed to limit the political participation of people who were not considered white or who were foreign born. They also pushed for assimilation, the abandoning of one's ethnic identity and practices for white ethnics, right? White ethnics basically had to erase their ethnic identity if they wish to have an opportunity to participate in civic life or have opportunities for better jobs. And often schools were used as a tool of assimilation, as a strategy to try to integrate the foreign-born population's children especially, but also to try to mute their power by getting them to not see themselves as distinct from the dominant society. Many of the leaders in education advocated for mass public education for young people, especially the children of immigrants. I'll talk more about this in a second, but I just wanted to make mention that this was at the same time that we saw the emergence of what has been referred to as the enclosure movement. The enclosure movement was a set of practices that were designed by the elite for the elite to ensure that their children were internalizing the correct kind of culture. They were very aware of their social class location, their unique position within society, and why they were there. And they made efforts to control who their children were interacting with. They were very ethnocentric and frankly white supremacist. They supported they supported the mass public education movement, but those public schools were not intended to be for their children, but for the foreigners' children and for recalcitrant youth, basically people that were perceived as deviants. Now, here's an excerpt from a teaching journal that exemplifies how educators saw immigrants coming to the United States. And here in that first line, it is referring to the immigrant population. And I think it's important to read the quote in its entirety. So that's what I'm going to do. So it says, "Will it, like the muddy Missouri, as it pours its water into the clear Mississippi and contaminates the whole united mass, spread ignorance and vice, crime and disease through our native population? If we can by any means purify this foreign population, enlighten their ignorance, and bring them up to our level, we shall perform a work of true and perfect charity, blessing the giver and receiver of equal measure. With the old, not much can be done, but with their children, the great remedy is education. The rising generation must be taught as our children are taught. We say must be because in many cases, this can only be accomplished by coercion." You can see the xenophobia and ethnocentrism in the education leaders' comment language. Moreover, if people wanted access to good, respectable jobs, the Protestant establishment had the social, political, and economic capital as leaders of their communities and owners of business to require certain skills and credentials. Those credentials were intended to limit the number of people who had access to those jobs, but they were also intended to ensure that people would get trained in a way that they internalized the morals and values and perspectives and capacities, right, that reinforced the Protestant establishment. Prior to the mass education movement, schooling was much like the proverbial Wild West, where pretty much anything goes. Early in our nation's history, there were three main types of schools. The first was an elementary school. These schools taught basic literacy skills, and that schooling really had no impact on the social status of those who attended the schools. The Latin grammar schools and colleges had formal classical training. These were mostly for those who prepared to become teachers and religious leaders. Then there were the academies. These were for the children of the elite and often included classical education, that related to the mastery of knowledge that would make those individuals culturally distinct from the masses. This education was for those who were and expected their children to be members of the governing class in the United States. There was no standard sequencing in these schools, and sometimes they were teaching very similar things. Typically, the requirements to enter into Latin grammar schools, colleges, and academies was having some basic literacy skills, being able to pay tuition, and being of the right faith. These schools were often competing for students. Andover Academy is one such school. Let me move this out of the way so you can see their flag. Andover Academy is one such school that is still in operation. This is a picture of one of their halls that still gets used. We'll be doing 2 readings from a book about these types of schools. The academies were really part of that enclosure movement. They were boarding schools and have been referred to as total institutions. Let me go back here, sorry. The public schools that were at the root of our modern public schools did not emerge to help train workers to become part of the new industrial age. They actually first emerged in urban centers that had high foreign-born populations. When there were political or social crises, the elite in the community often thought of schooling as a solution. They saw schools as places where they could teach the proper morality. Kids who were seen as delinquents, which also corresponded with being an ethnic minority, hanging out in bowling alleys or gambling or smoking or swearing, were often required to go to school as punishment for their bad or deviant behavior. As the previous excerpt demonstrated, the elite believed their culture was the source of their bad behavior. They saw schooling as a way of helping children adopt Protestant ideals. They were taught to read, but often the tool used to help children to read was the Bible, and they were taught to write, but their bodies were closely regulated as they learned to write. For to discipline the body was also to discipline the mind. So in essence, you had the emergence and development of 2 types of schools, one for the elite that would prepare them for their places as leaders of the community, and one for the masses that was designed to get them to accept the status quo. As I said earlier, oftentimes schools were competing for the same pool of students. And because there were really no regulations or centralized authorities, people would start schools. And as schools proliferated, they would threaten the existence of already existing schools. So those schools with established connections to power centers in government and industry leveraged their organizational connections to limit their competition. Elite colleges and universities like Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, and etc. These schools approached academies and suggested that their students could gain entry into their institutions by taking an entrance exam. And to prepare for this exam, those colleges and universities proposed curriculum for their secondary school students. Secondary schools then turned to lower grade levels with similar social statuses and did something similar to them. This effectively limited competition and compelled like a sequencing that happened as students moved through grade levels. It ensured matriculation of students into programs and secured their status. These colleges and universities developed programs and conferred professional degrees. Many of these schools had alumni who were institutional elite and maintained their organizational connections to institutional elites in the government and private sectors. In essence, graduating from these schools conferred and continue to confer status upon their graduates. For lower status schools, in order to gain legitimacy, they modeled themselves after those elite colleges and universities, trying to look like them would help legitimate those lower status colleges and universities, but in mimicking the elite status, elite colleges and universities, they also legitimated those colleges and universities positions at the top of the hierarchy. So you can still see lower status colleges and universities model themselves after those higher ones. And even though they can't compete in terms of like the college rankings, US college rankings of prestigious colleges and universities, what we start to see is lower status colleges and universities compete for unique designations. Like, I was just thinking about how at the UC Center, when you come in, there used to be a graphic. I don't know if it's still there, but it would say that we were like the number one um, uh, island university, or university that's also an island. And yeah, so even then, right, it's this kind of mimicking, we're going to be number one at something. Now, the expansion of education and credentialism in terms of, businesses and industries requiring a degree, um, that education and credentialism is not as functional as a cert, because if you look at the origins of the structure of our schools and the requirements of credentials, um, it wasn't to identify the most talented or to train the most talented to fill the most important positions, or to help people adapt to a changing world, or to support other social institutions. The expansion and the sequencing of schooling and the requirements of credentials in order to fulfill a position um, is actually rooted in elite individuals and institutions um, implementing strategies to secure and maintain their privilege. The development of our education system was, or has, its historical origins in the elite trying to preserve their power and leveraging their cultural capital, their organizational positions, to create a system that ultimately would benefit themselves. And we're going to see this over and over again throughout the readings that I've curated for you. I'm going to stop right there.